Well, we've had a couple of weeks break,
Yeah.
so I hope you took advantage of that. I hope you had a uh, good break last week. We are back to our study, back to the prophetic analysis step that we're looking at together, and we're going to continue on in that step. The last week we talked about, or last time we met, I mean. These 6 specific steps when we're looking at the prophetic analysis. Again, remember, that's the 4th step. After looking at the book as a whole, then we focus on the passage. And that the first step in looking at the passage is what we call prophetic analysis. And that's made up of 6 steps. We've covered the first 4 in the last several sessions, which involve the first step is depending on the genre, if it's poetic or narrative, we need to do that analysis on the passage where it applies. So if it's poetic, for example, we want to be able to look at the imagery, look at the figurative language, the poetic devices, and see if there's any parallelism as well. Then the second step is to identify the nature and time frame of the passage, meaning is it speaking of future events or present events or a mixture? We have to be able to determine that. And then the third step is simply identify the type of prophetic genre. And we looked at, there's generally 2, okay? There is the judgment oracles, which focus on judgment, whether it's judgment in the near future or the far future. And in those oracles, if you remember, they typically have a format where there's the people are addressed directly. There's an expression of woe or of what their sins that need to be that they've committed, the judgment for that, and the call to repentance. Now, that's in the judgment oracle. The salvation oracle is the other kind of prophetic genre, and that, of course, focuses on deliverance, whether it's near future or far future deliverance, and particularly the restoration of Israel in the Messianic age. Right, that's usually the focus in the salvation oracles. And then we looked at a third category, which is really a special form of judgment oracle called apocalyptic, which apocalyptic prophetic in prophecy is really more fantastic, more amazing, more colorful, a lot of symbolism, worldwide cataclysms and events like that. So it's a much more and fanciful creatures are often part of that as well. And then the 4th step, which we looked at last time, was to try to identify what appears to be symbolic language within the prophecy. Are there any symbols? And again, symbols are different than figurative language, in that figurative language is more for the poetic style. Symbols are actually items within the prophecy that are intended to refer to something specific, like another country or something else. All right. So, can you guys see, by the way, on your screen, can you see I've got the Bible text on one side and the notes on the other. Everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure. Now, today we're going to turn our attention to answering the question, and this is very important, is how does the passage I'm looking at, this prophetic passage, how does it fit within the author's flow of thought? Now, we've talked about this concept, this hermeneutic, very often in this course, and in the last course, and in the module before that, because of the context is so important. But it is especially important when you're looking at prophecy, because, again, remember that prophecy is often given, the future events being foretold is often given within a context where the prophet is speaking to a present audience and calling them to respond. And so he will give a future event or events in order that are connected to, in some way, his sermon, his message to his present audience. Okay. Only occasionally does a prophet speak to a future audience. Like, for example, in Isaiah chapter 40, Isaiah there is directing his message towards a future audience, the people of Judah after the exile. But most often, the prophet is addressing an audience in his day. And so you have to keep that in mind. So when he speaks of a future event, of a future prophecy, that prophecy is connected to the context in which he is speaking. So I'll show you an example of that here, that we actually looked at this text some time ago, but we'll talk about it. So to interpret a prophetic text, it's really important you understand the author's flow of thought. You kind of think of it like a parable. You know, when Jesus gave a parable, that parable was prompted by something somebody said, or a particular action, or a statement, or a problem. So, for example, you know, the parable of the unforgiving servant. Jesus gave that parable in response to Peter's statement, question, how many times must I forgive, Lord? 7 times? And Peter thought he was being very generous by saying 7 times. And then you remember, Jesus said, no, 70 times 7, which was a figurative way to say, you know, that you forgive all the time. And then he gave a parable to communicate the importance of forgiveness. That was the parable of the ungrateful servant who was forgiven a large debt, and then he did not forgive a fellow servant his debt. That parable came out of a particular question and a particular attitude by Peter, an unwillingness to forgive. Or you could think of the parable of the Good Samaritan. That was prompted by one of the lawyers, the scribes, who asked Jesus a question about who is my neighbor. When Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, and he said, well, who is my neighbor? Well, that prompted a parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. So you can think of prophetic utterances in a similar way, that they're not just a random future event that the prophet decides he wants to tell the future about. No, they were those events, those future events he speaks of, were specifically chosen because it's prompted by the current situation of his audience, or something that he has told them. All right, let me give you an example of this from a passage that we looked at some time ago from Micah. Micah chapter 4 and 5. I don't know if you remember this. We talked about this passage. In Micah chapter 1 to 3, Micah is speaking of judgment oracles upon the people of Judah in particular, because of their sin, their injustice, their violence against their neighbor. So in chapter 3, he speaks of a coming judgment upon them. And then we get to chapter 4. So again, here's the judgment in chapter 3. Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble. The temple hill, a mound overgrown with thickets. So he's describing this coming judgment upon Jerusalem. And then he gets to a future, he continues talking about the future, and he gives another prophetic utterance connected to chapter 3. I want us to read, we're going to read this chapter again. Of course, you guys remember Micah 5:2, right? But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth. You remember that passage, right? We read it every Christmas. All right. Well, what was the context of that passage? what did Micah say before that? And why did he give that statement? Was he just telling people in the future, hey, this is where the Messiah is going to be born? Or was there another reason that he mentions this particular statement about the coming of the Messiah and where he would be born? And what does he say before that? All right, so let's go back to chapter 4, verse 1. I'm going to ask a few of you guys to read here. Let's see, Pastor Manuel, can you go ahead and read verses 1 to 4? And then Pastor Ramil, if you could read verses 5 through 8.
Verse 1 to 4. Micah chapter 4, verse 1. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. I will be raised above the hills. The people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his path. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty, distant nation. Then they will hammer their sword into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. Verse 4. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken.
Verse 5. Though all the people walk each in the name of his God. As for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. In that day, declares the Lord, I will assemble the lame and gather the outcasts, even those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant, and the outcast a strong nation, and the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion, from now on and forever. As for you, tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it will come, even the former dominion will come, the kingdom of the daughters of Jerusalem.
Okay, so here in these first 8 verses of chapter 4, notice this statement. Micah says it will come about in the last days. Okay, so now he's moved further ahead in time to, and remember, the last days is often a reference to sometime around the Messianic kingdom, the day of the Lord. All right, so he moves ahead to the time of the Messianic kingdom in the far future, and he describes what it will be like and how he will take care of his people and protect them and provide for them. Notice again, verse 6, in that day. Then he describes what he's going to do for them. So in verses 1 to 8, he focuses on the far future, the Messianic kingdom. Now, notice what happens in verse 9. And I'm going to ask Edwin if you could read verses 9 and 10.
Verse 9. Now, why do you cry out loudly? Is there no king among you? Or has your counselor perished? That agony has gripped you like a woman in childbirth. Writ and labor to give birth, daughter of Zion, like a woman in childbirth. For now you will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to Babylon. There will be a rescued. There the Lord will redeem you from the land of your enemies.
Okay, so notice he says now. That's sort of a time reference. But here he's saying, okay, in verses 1 to 8, he'd just been describing, the future when the Lord will reign and we will be blessed and cared for in the last days. And then look at verse 9. He says, why do you cry out loudly? Wait a minute, Micah. Why would they cry out if God's making all these promises and how it will be so blessed? Well, you see, now Micah is going to another time in the future. And we have a clue. When is that time he's speaking of?
For now, you
will go out of the city, dwell in the field, and go to where?
Babylon.
Babylon. Now, in the near future, about 100 years after Micah, the people of Judah are taken into captivity into Babylon. And so now in verses 9 and 10, Micah has come back in time from the far future. He now comes to the near future, about 100 years from his time, speaking of the exile. All right, so the far future, there will be the Lord will reign over them, but in the near future, there will be no king among them. They will cry out loudly in agony and despair because they are taken into Babylon. Okay, now this hasn't happened yet. Micah ministered here, I show over here, in around 735 to 710 BC. If you'll remember, the Babylonian exile, that began around 605 BC. Okay, till about 536 BC. Remember, Jeremiah predicted they'd be 70 years in captivity. Well, here, so this event is about 100 years or so after Micah. So he is speaking of the future, but he's gone from the far future, the Messianic kingdom, verses 1 to 8. Now he's speaking of the near future. Well, that's kind of strange. Why would he do that? Well, let's keep going. Verses 11 to 13. Kent, can you read that, please?
And now many nations have been assembled against you, who say, let her be polluted, and let our eyes gloat over Zion. But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they don't understand his purpose. For he has gathered them like a sheaves to the threshing floor. Arise and thresh, daughter of Zion, for your horn I will make iron, and your hoops I will make bronze, that you may pulverize many peoples, that you may devote to the Lord their unjust gain, and their wealth to the Lord of all the earth.
All right. Notice here, again, this term, and now many nations. So it's like, almost like, it's kind of like a movie where you're shown one scene and then it switches to another scene. And then it switches to another scene. That's what's happening here in 11 when he says, and now, okay, another switch in time. Many nations have assembled against you. Let our eyes gloat over Zion. When is it that many nations are going to surround Jerusalem to destroy her? You guys remember? When the nations gather around Jerusalem, that's going to be at the time of Armageddon. All right, in the far future, we're again back to Armageddon, and just before when Jesus returns, the second coming, and then he defeats all of the people's enemies. So here, here it speaks of, he goes from verses 9 and 10, the Babylonian exile. Now he jumps ahead again to the far future, just before the Messianic kingdom. All right. So again, what's going on here, Micah? And then let's look at Micah 5:1. I'll go ahead and read this verse. Now, oh, here we go again. Now muster your troops, or yourselves in troops, daughter of troops. They have laid siege against us. With the rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek. Now this verse is a little bit more difficult to exactly determine what time he's speaking of, but notice that word now. Okay, again, Micah seems to be using that word to indicate a shift in time, and I believe, based on the statement, with the rod they will smite the judge of Israel on the cheek, I think is a reference to when the king of Babylon took Zedekiah captive and gouged out his eyes. We can't be exactly certain of that, but that seems to be the event he's speaking of here. And that event took place at the beginning of the Babylonian exile, or near the beginning. All right, again, about 100 years in the future, in Micah's future. Okay, then we have the famous verses. We'll let John read the famous verses, all right? Micah 5 verses, can you read verses 2 and 3?
Yes.
Thank you.
Micah 5, 2 and 3. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel.
Okay, John, when does this event take place?
Jesus
Yeah,
time,
this is the birth of the Messiah, right?
birth of Jesus.
And again, that's about 700 years in the future. Okay, do you see what's going on here? Look at this. For the first 8 verses of the chapter, far future, messianic kingdom. Then verses 9 and 10, near future, the Babylonian exile. Verses 11 to 13, far future, just before the messianic kingdom. Then verse 1 in chapter 5, back to the near future, this time around the beginning of the exile. And then verses 2 and 3 of chapter 5, he goes ahead again, but not far future. This time he goes to the birth of the Messiah, about 700 years. And then look at verse 4. I'll read that. Or John, why don't you read verse 4 if you don't mind?
Okay. And he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth.
Millennium.
Okay, yes. We're back to the messianic kingdom, right? Because Jesus, we know he's great to the ends of the earth, but he is not seen that way by all the earth yet, right? He has not yet arisen to shepherd his flock, the people of Israel, because again, that's who this is addressed to. So this is speaking again of the messianic kingdom in the very next verse. All right, far future. All right, we don't know how far because it hasn't happened yet. And then verse 5, he goes back to Assyrian invasion. And so he's going back, goes back in time there. But again, so take a look here. Back and forth, back and forth. All right, now if the intent of prophecy was to give us an order of events in the future, Micah failed here. Okay? Big time, right? If someone was reading this or hearing this in Micah's day, they wouldn't know that, right? They wouldn't realize he's speaking going back, but we do, because some of these events have taken place and some of them haven't. Right? Obviously, the Babylonian exile has, the birth of the Messiah has, but the Messianic kingdom hasn't come yet. The second coming has not taken place. And so we don't, we know that's still future. So we know here Micah is going back and forth in time, and it's very puzzling. Why would he do that? He's clearly not intending to present a chronological record of events, an order in time. Okay, so either he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he has a specific intent in sharing future events, and it is not just so we can fill in our time charts. He's referring to specific future events, and even in those particular things that happen in those future events. Because first, Micah chapter 3, speaking of judgment upon Israel that's going to happen in the future. Then in chapter 4, he begins with this beautiful picture of the Messianic kingdom and the joy that they will experience there. And then he goes back in verse 9 and he says, why do you cry aloud? So he goes from this peaceful, joyful time in the future to a bad time in the future, the Babylonian exile. That was no fun for the people of Israel. So why does he do that? Why does he go from a happy time to this sad time? Then he goes to another dire situation for Israel when the nations have gathered around her at Armageddon. And then he goes back to the Babylonian exile when the king Zedekiah was taken, his sons were killed in front of him, and his eyes were gouged out. Not a good time in Israel's history. Then he goes to the birth of the Messiah, and then to the Messianic kingdom that the Messiah will bring. So this is what makes prophecy hard, because you're thinking, what is he doing? How are we supposed to figure out what he's talking about here? Again, we cannot look at prophecy, prophetic text, as solely just telling us future events so we can know what's going to happen. You know, we get our charts out and we go, okay, this is the next event, and then the next event, and the next event. Micah's not doing that here. He's not concerned about dating prophetic events for us. Micah here is trying to say something to his audience in his day. He's just spoken about the complete destruction of Jerusalem in chapter 3. Now, if you were sitting there listening to Micah talking about this and saying, God's going to bring judgment upon Zion and Jerusalem will be devastated, what would you be thinking? Well, that doesn't sound good. What's going to happen to us? Are we in trouble? I mean, what are we going to do? And so Micah begins in chapter 4, verse 1, speaking of future events that demonstrate God's care for his people. And so in verses 1 to 8, he says, look, there will be judgment upon Israel, but remember, the Messiah will come and bring this wonderful messianic reign. Now, you would think, okay, that's great, but why did Micah keep going and talk about these other bad events in their future after he just described the blissful messianic kingdom? Well, there's a pattern. It's very interesting. Go back to 4, 9, and 10. Okay, so verses 1 to 8, again, this is the description of the messianic kingdom, of peace, of joy, that there won't be the poor, there won't be afflicted, there won't be the lame, all of that, all those good things. And then verse 9, Micah goes to a time that describes their suffering in the Babylonian exile. But then notice what he says at the end of verse 10. There you will be rescued. There the Lord will redeem you. All right. So he speaks of this Babylonian exile, which was in the near future, and how bad it's going to be. But then he says, you will be rescued. Okay. So that's one example. Then he goes to a second example in verses 11 to 13, where he describes the nations in the future are going to gather against Zion, and they're going to seek to do her harm. But notice in verse 13, he describes God's rescue. Again, they're going to be in a bad situation in the future. God will rescue them. Then chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, verse 1 describes a time in the future when they're going to be attacked and the king will be struck. Okay, so you see the pattern? Future bad event for Israel, then God rescues. Future bad event for Israel, then God rescues. And then here in verse 1, future bad event for Israel, and then a rescue, the Messiah. But there's something unique in this third example. Okay, you guys follow me so far?
Yes, Tim.
If
Yes.
you don't,
Yes.
ask a question. All right, so the pattern is this. You've got chapter 4, 1 through 8, sort of a description of the bliss of the Messianic kingdom. And then in 4:9 through 5:2, Micah gives 3 examples of future events where Israel or Judah is in trouble and God rescues them. Okay? Now, this might give us a little bit of an indication why he picked those events out of order. All right, he was just picking future. So we have in 4, 9, and 10, right? That's as I said before, that's the Babylonian exile, and then God will rescue them. And then 4, 11 through 13, that was in Armageddon, the far future, and then God will rescue. And then we have 5, 1 to 3. All right, he looks to the Babylonian exile, but in this, there's something different in this third example. And the difference is this. In 4, 9, and 10, the problem for Israel and God's rescue happens within 70 years. Right? When they go into exile, and then when God delivers them, that's 70 years, right? The second example, the rescue is almost immediate. The nations gather around Jerusalem, and then Jesus returns and destroys all the nations. But the third example, there's a long gap in time. Over 600 years. So he brings up a problem, the Babylonian exile, but he doesn't talk about a rescue until he speaks of the Messiah coming in 5, 2, and 3. There's this long gap. And in fact, that gap is so large that the Hebrew Bible actually includes this verse in chapter 4. It doesn't start chapter 5 until verse 2 because they didn't see the connection. So again, there's a question. What's Micah doing here? There seems to be a pattern, but then he breaks the pattern. And again, he's going back and forth in time. This is only, very confusing. Well, there's 2 things going on here. One is, yes, God has described judgment upon Jerusalem and Israel in chapter 3, but in chapters 4 and 5, he's trying to remind them, but that you will be rescued. There will be restoration. I will take care of you. All right, that's one thing going on here, but there's something else that Micah is doing, which explains not only the going back and forth, but also why this third example has such a large gap between the Israel's problem and God's rescue. Okay? And so there's something running in the background. There's a problem that's not resolved. And it goes back to a question that was asked in chapter 4, verse 9. Notice this question. When he goes back, it goes to another time, speaking of the Babylonian exile, he says, why do you cry loudly? So he's speaking to this future audience, those in exile, saying, why do you cry loudly? Is there no king among you? And then in verse 1 of chapter 5, with the rod they will smite the judge, or I think that's a reference to the king of Israel, on the cheek. that this question, is there no king among you, is actually very significant. It might not seem important, but it actually is very important, because Micah is speaking of, this is really the key question in the chapter, in chapter 4 and 5. And what Micah's doing here is trying to help them to think about, okay, who is the one who's going to rescue them and deliver them in these cases from their enemies? Who is the one who will bring God's kingdom? Who is the one that will reign and bring prosperity in that kingdom? Who is the one who will bring judgment? You see, before God's kingdom can come, there has to be a king, right? And we, of course, know the answer here, right? There has to be a king. And so Micah 5:2 is really sticks out in this whole series of events that Micah describes, because he's trying to get them to think about, there are going to be problems in the future. We're going to need someone to rescue us. Who is going to be the ultimate rescuer? It's one who's going to be born in Bethlehem, who, as it turns out, is from the days of eternity. And so what Micah is doing here is, one, he's going back and forth in time because he's picking particular events when Israel was in trouble and God rescued them, in order to build up to the point where he wants to focus all attention on the ultimate rescuer, who is the Messiah, who will be a man who is going to be born as a man. And it's even mentioned the specific place he will be born. I think perhaps to encourage them that this is something that will happen. It's not a vague possible future event, but he's very specific. This one, where he will be born and who he is. And that one is the one who is the ultimate rescuer of God's people. And as it turns out, is a specific prophecy about the birthplace of this coming king. So there could be no doubt that where the Messiah would be born, and that this is the one who would bring ultimate peace and will someday usher in the Messianic kingdom. And so all this is to say, really, this is a long illustration, but it's to make this point, is that when we understand the flow of thought here, and we see that Micah is not giving prophetic events in this particular order and time, he's going back and forth discussing future events because he has a purpose in that. He's trying to identify future times when the people of Israel are in trouble and how God rescued them, as a way to prepare for Micah to declare the ultimate rescuer in the Messiah, who we know, of course, to be Jesus Christ, the Lord. And he was wanting to really set up Micah 5:2 and 3, and then ultimately describes in verse 4, this is the one who is going to bring peace and be great to the ends of the earth. The very thing he talked about in the first 8 verses of chapter 4. This is the one born in Jerusalem, who will reign in the kingdom and bring peace and restoration for good for God's people. All right, and so this is a really key example to show us you can't just look at prophecy and sort of assume this is just being given in order to explain a certain order of events in the future. That's not usually what the prophets do. They speak of future events because it has a significance for their present audience. And so they may pick events in a very different order in order to convey a point that they're trying to make. In this case, that God is their rescuer, and then the ultimate rescuer of the Lord is the Messiah. Okay, I don't know if that helped or hurt, but are there any questions about, does that make sense to you guys? Do you have any questions about that?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
I was fully reminded of what you taught us several weeks ago about how we look into the prophecy into three descriptions, such as salvation. It is salvation or deliverance. Number two is judgment, and number three is apocalyptic. So, as you have given us the example of Micah chapter 4, verses 1 to 8, so Messianic kingdom means the far future salvation or deliverance. Chapter 4, verses 9 to 10, Babylonian exile, judgment. Okay. Chapter 4, 11 to 13, Armageddon, apocalyptic. Yeah. Chapter 5, verse 1, another judgment. Chapter 5, verses 2 and 3, birth of the Messiah, salvation or deliverance. Chapter 5, verse 4, Messianic kingdom, salvation.
Yeah, there's a mix. Yeah, even and then the over kind of the thing, all of it as a whole, Micah chapters 4 and 5 is meant to convey the idea of God's deliverance, delivering Israel when Israel is in trouble. That's his point. Because he's been talking in the first 3 chapters of Micah about judgment. And so, but he wants to remind them that there will not be, that there is a time in the future God will fulfill his promises and restore Israel. And we know that because he gives 3 examples of it. One, the example in the Babylonian exile, when God, after 70 years, delivers them out of that. 2, in the future, far future in Armageddon, when the nations surround Jerusalem to destroy her, and actually the Messiah comes to deliver Israel. And then the 3rd example, he looks at a Babylonian exile event, but then he jumps way ahead to the Messiah's birth in order to focus attention on the Messiah as the ultimate deliverer. So we do see sort of judgment scattered in there, but the overall purpose of chapter 4 and 5 is the salvation, deliverance. And that ultimate deliverance comes through the Messiah. John?
Yeah, Pastor Tim, is it like this for all the prophetic books? Like there's not one prophecy that it talks about.
Picture.
That's a good question. No, it depends. Some places like Zechariah 14, for example, speaks of just the second coming and the reign of the Messiah. So there's no mixing of other events there. But Isaiah 9, 6, and 7 describes the incarnation and the second coming. But it doesn't distinguish that. We wouldn't know, because the verse there is just focused on God's going to send a Messiah who is actually God. And so it all depends on what the author, the message he's trying to communicate. That's my point. And sometimes he may speak of just one event and give a very clear, detailed order of that event, like in Zechariah 14. Other times, like here in Micah, he may speak of several future events and may not really give them in particular order. And so in order to, if we understand the flow of thought of the author and what he's trying to accomplish in speaking of those future events, then we'll have, that's really the message we're supposed to get. Not just, okay, what happens next? And then what happens? And then what happens? That's not Micah's intent here at all. He's trying to give confidence to his hearers that judgment is coming, but remember, God will bring deliverance through the Messiah. And just so you can be confident, that Messiah will be born in this specific place, in Bethlehem, Ephrathah. So we have the benefit of being in the future, so we can know if some of those events have already happened. But again, the original audience didn't have that luxury. Everything was in the future to them. They didn't know the order necessarily. They knew of a coming Messiah, but they wouldn't have known all these different. And in fact, I don't think the Babylonian exile was not yet predicted. So they wouldn't have known about, they just wouldn't have known about that specifically. So we have to put ourselves in the place of the original audience to sort of understand what Micah's trying to do here. He's speaking of future events. Yes, it's prophecy. Yes, because their events are future. But what he's focusing on, and really why, what is it about those future events that he's trying to show the original hearers? And in this case, it's the theme of God's rescuing his people, and the ultimate rescue being through the Messiah. Long answer to a short question, but does that answer what you were asking, John?
Yes, Pastor Tim, thank you.
Pastor Tim, every prophets that speak about in the last days, it refers to Messianic kingdom. It depends on the context of what they can.
Yeah, well, context is always important, but I believe most of the time when you see the reference in the last days, it's speaking of either the day of the Lord, which is the tribulation period, or in the ushering of the Messianic kingdom. It could be the Messianic kingdom. That's normally what it refers to. I'm trying to think of a reference where it doesn't. I think there's a couple references in Isaiah where it may be referring to another event, but I can't remember. But we know in this case it is the Messianic kingdom because of how he describes it in chapter 4. All right. But yeah, in that day or in the last days, that's usually a reference to the days of the second coming, day of the Lord. Did you have another question or comment, Ken?
Yeah. Does Prophet Micah knows, because does the prophets know what will happen in the middle when they prophesy the future event?
Yeah, another good question. Well, Peter describes, let's see, 2 Peter, was it 1? I'm trying to remember where Peter brings up I thought it was 2 Peter. Maybe it was 1 Peter. He talks about the prophets not understanding, not knowing. Maybe it was 1 Peter. Sorry, give me a second to. Oh, why can't I remember where this? Maybe one of you remembers that passage that Peter speaks of the prophets. Is this where it is?
Verse 10.
Yeah, but there was must be another verse I'm thinking of. Yeah, here in verse 10, he does describe the prophets, how they knew they were speaking of the Messiah. Notice he says Spirit of Christ, Christos Messiah, but they didn't know the details. They didn't know the timing. So I'm sure Micah, as he was prophesying here, he understood he was speaking of the future Messiah, you know, but he didn't know specifically when that it would take place. And as far as Babylon's concerned, you know, whether Micah knew he was going back and forth in time like that, it's hard to say. If Micah was fully aware of that, that's always a challenge, because you know, he doesn't give a lot of specifics. He just refers to some general aspects of these events. So I don't know. I've forgotten now your question, Kent. Sorry. I was trying to find that passage. Did that address it at all, or?
Yes, it most is more on general term that it will happen in the future, especially chapter 5, verse 1 to 2. Verse 2 is going forth and from long ago, from the days eternity past. Verse 1, with a rod they will smite the judge of Israel in the cheek. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, too little be among the clans of from you will go forth for me to be a ruler in Israel from the days of eternity. So maybe he speak here.
Oh, you got muted.
That Christ would reign in the future event. It's a two, even these verses, it's a two one events. He's born and he's reigning in the Messianic kingdom.
Yeah, and whether Micah was aware that his birth and his reign would be separated, you know, isn't clear. I don't know if that's something we could know. If they understood that, you know, sort of that there's a difference in those events, like Isaiah when he predicted that, you know, a child will be born to you, a son will be given, right? Isaiah 9:6. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. Well, that hasn't happened yet, literally. That's a future event, but the child has been born. That's happened. So whether Isaiah knew there was a distinction here between the first and second coming, it's not clear.
Maybe Pastor Tim, what's in my mind is through the revelation of John, the Apostle John, because John saw the vision that what will may happen. That's where my thinking came from. That kind of question.
Yeah, and John, you know, if we study Revelation, John borrows, or Revelation has a lot of connections to the Old Testament prophecies. There's a lot of imagery, even direct quotes from the Old Testament prophets. So there's a lot of interconnection between, we call it intertextuality, between book of Revelation and the Old Testament prophets. And that's why it helps to study these guys, because when you read Revelation, if you know the Old Testament prophets well, you'll be able to see those certain connections. But yeah, John, obviously looking back, he would know some of these events had been fulfilled, right? The exile, birth of the Messiah. He would know that had already happened.
So last question, Pastor Tim. So our passage, Pastor Tim, that you assigned to us, will we look also the pattern of this kind of pattern?
Your passages, yeah, your text in Zechariah only speak of one particular vision of the future. I don't think you have to worry about, I'm trying to think of all those. I don't think you have to worry about this kind of back and forth, okay? This is a hard, very, very hard. When I preached this passage, it was very, very hard. One, just trying to figure out what Micah was doing, but then how do I preach this to my congregation? I mean, what's the point for them? So I didn't go through all this detail like I did with you guys. They'd be going, well, is it lunchtime yet? So I had to figure out, okay, what's the message here from Micah to his people? And what's the timeless truth then from that message that applies to us today, So that was Micah 4 and 5 was very, very hard. So I didn't do that to you. Your Zechariah passages are one vision speaking of one particular event in time. Okay. Now, all those visions aren't the same event in time. A few of them are different, like different times, but you don't have to worry about within that vision having different, from what I remember. I'm trying to go through all of them in my mind. I don't think you have to worry about that. Praise God. Hallelujah.
Yeah, that's the purpose of the question, Pastor Tim.
No, these guys can be pretty difficult, but that's why it's important if you can just it's like the parables, again, if you can just focus on, okay, what was the flow of thought here? What prompted this prophetic utterance? If you know that, if you know what he's been talking about, that will help you to know, okay, I think I understand. I may not know all the details of this prophecy, but at least I think I understand why he gave it. That's the key. What's the purpose of that prophetic utterance in the author's flow of thought? And I mean, that's really what we need to do for every passage in every genre. But I think in the prophetic genre, that will help you a little bit to know, okay, he just gave this prophecy of a future event. Now, what did he talk about before that led up to him giving this prophecy? And what seems to be the focus of this prophecy? And here it was Israel in trouble, God rescues. Israel in trouble, God rescues. Israel in trouble, God rescues ultimately through his Messiah. Okay. Okay. Whew, boy. Wow, that took a while, huh? I hope I hope that helped a little bit. I'm going to go on. We're going to do something just as complicated here next, okay? Just to prepare you, all right? You guys ready? You paying attention? Focused?
We're bored, ready.
Excited? All right. Let's go on to another top. Okay, here's just a summary. And you'll have your notes, so if some of this doesn't make sense, hopefully the notes will explain it. Okay, I just kind of gave all of this to you verbally. Now, so really that whole illustration was just to emphasize the importance of understanding how the prophetic text you're looking at fits into the author's flow of thought. What he said before, what he said after, what he focuses on. Again, remembering these prophets were preaching to the present day audience for the most part. And therefore, the prophecy they're speaking of had something about that future event is connected to his sermon and the point he's trying to make in the sermon. Now, once you've done that, the last thing you want to do after you've looked at their passage, looking at the time frame of the passage, the type of prophecy that it is, looking for symbolic language, if there's poetry, looking at the poetic and the figurative language, and then asking, okay, how does this prophecy fit within the author's flow of thought? Once you've done all that, the last thing you want to do is note if the prophecy or passage is cited to or alluded in and actually elsewhere in the Bible, and not just the New Testament. All right. Is this passage cited, that is it quoted, or is it sort of alluded to in another book of Scripture? And is it said to be fulfilled in that particular reference? Okay, now we need to be careful with what we call fulfillment language when somebody says that this has been fulfilled. All right, because it doesn't always mean that the prophecy has been completed. Okay, sometimes the author, particularly the New Testament, may be speaking of a general point from the context of that passage. Let me give you a few examples that hopefully clear this up. Now, here's one. Let's see. Jason, are you there? Can you read this passage in Matthew chapter 2?
Matthew chapter verse 21. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. But after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and lived in the city of Nazareth. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene.
Thank you. Now, we're probably familiar with this passage from Matthew. Notice what I highlighted in yellow there. Right? Matthew's speaking of Jesus returning with his parents, going to the city of Nazareth. And then what does it say? This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, there's only one problem with this, guys. There's no verse in the Old Testament that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. What? But Matthew just said it fulfills what was spoken through the prophets. Is this a mistake? Did Matthew use the wrong Bible translation?
No.
What do you mean there's no verse that he shall be called a Nazarene? And then, if that's the case, why does Matthew say it was to fulfill? If there's no verse to fulfill, how can it be fulfilled? What's happening? Oh, it's Micah all over again. I don't know what's going on. Okay. What is happening here? Well, this is why I said be careful with that word fulfill. Okay? It doesn't always mean there's a specific prophecy that has now been completed. In this case, there's no specific prophecy that says explicitly that the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. However, Matthew was not making reference to a specific prophecy, but to per se, but to the general idea that many prophets spoke of the Messiah as being a shoot or a branch of Jesse, right? You guys remember Isaiah 11:1? A shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse and a branch from his roots. Do you know the word branch is the word netzer in Hebrew? Netzer. Does that sound familiar? So when Nazarene comes from that word, netzer. Netzarene, actually. So Jesus lived in a place called basically shoot town or branch town. Now that would be sort of like a fulfillment of the prophets that said he would be a shoot or a branch. It's a play on words, really. That the Messiah, there wasn't a prophecy that said he would live in Nazarene, but there were prophecies that said Jesus was a netzer of Jesse, of David, a branch or a root, meaning he came from the line of David, the line of Jesse. And so in that sense, Matthew was saying it's fulfilled, not in a specific sense where he's quoting a particular passage, but in a general sense that Jesus was the Messiah as prophesied, and he is the netzer, or the Netzarene. You understand that?
Pastor Tim, it might be that the idea of Nazarene means the people living there, what kind of people, what kind of custom, what kind of character of the people there. That's why they were called Nazarene.
Yeah, and if you remember, Nazareth at that time was considered a, you remember, who was it? Was it Philip that said, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?"
Yeah,
Remember that? So Nazareth was actually kind of a really,
bad type of people there.
yeah, poorly thought of. It wasn't a great place in the minds of the people. But the word Nazarene, which comes from Netzer, that definitely has a connection to the Messiah. He was predicted to be a Netzer, a shoot or a branch from David. And so I think that's what Matthew's talking about. He's kind of making a connection between the place Jesus lived and who Jesus was referred to in the prophets. I think he's kind of a play on words, really, that he's doing here. So again, Matthew wasn't saying that there's a specific fulfillment of an Old Testament text, but just this general idea of a fulfillment that he would be from the line of Jesse.
Pastor Tim, it's big. It should be connected with the Nazarene Nazarene vow that Samson, Samson, that Paul.
Well, except it never says Jesus took that vow, and there's nothing in the context that refers to that vow. That was a Nazarite vow, not a Nazarene vow.
I thought it's Nazarene.
So, Pastor Tim, it might be that Jesus, as a light amidst of the darkness, yeah, living in a place where people so poor in their immorality, yeah. So it might be that Jesus, as a light, living needs in the darkness.
Yeah, certainly he was that, and that's talked about in other places. I think here Matthew's just simply pointing out the fact that the Messiah, his audience would remember, that the Messiah was described as a Netzer, and so I don't think they would have any confusion at all what Matthew was saying here. That yeah, we knew the Messiah was described as a sprout or a shoot from David's line. And so I think that's all Matthew's doing here. But my point is that there's not a specific prophecy that Matthew's referring to here. All right. But yet he says it's fulfilled, there's a fulfillment of sorts. So I'm just trying to help you guys understand. Be careful when you see fulfillment. Don't automatically think, okay, a specific prophecy and the author is saying that is now fulfilled. You need to make sure that the passage is quoting a direct reference, whether it's direct reference, explicit, or it's just a general reference to an Old Testament prophecy. If it's a direct quote, then we can identify how that Old Testament prophetic text is being used. All right. And how do we do that? So let's say that we do have a passage where it is a direct quote of an Old Testament text. What do we do at that point? Well, we have two things we have to do. In order to understand what the meaning of that New Testament quoting the Old Testament is, we first have to understand, what did the Old Testament author mean in his context? And then we have to understand what was the context of the New Testament passage in which he quoted the Old Testament one. So let me give you a few examples, and then if you have questions, go ahead and ask. Okay, let's see. Joshua, are you there? Can you read this passage, Matthew 2, 4-6?
Matthew 2 verses 4-6.
Yeah.
Is this okay? Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. For this is what has been written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.
Okay, where have we seen this before? Is this a direct quote? And I'll start with you, Joshua, since you read the passage. Do we see a direct quote here?
Yes, it's a direct. I think it's a direct quote.
Yeah, from Micah 5:2, which we just spent forever talking about. But here, actually, we have an example of an Old Testament quote text being quoted explicitly. And so we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, what was the context of that Old Testament quote? Well, we already talked about that ultimately Micah 5:2 was describing where the Messiah would come from. And so, and that was that the Messiah would be the ultimate deliverer of God's people. Now, here in Matthew, so we're understanding that context in Micah, we now come to Matthew and say, okay, what was going on here? Well, right, remember this was where the wise men came to King Herod, and Herod, they asked, where's the king of the Jews? And Herod called his chief priests and scribe together and said, where was this Messiah or king of the Jews going to be born? And notice, by the way, the scribes and chief priests took the prophecy literally, didn't they? They interpreted it literally, right? They interpreted, okay, when Micah said in Bethlehem of Judea that the ruler would come forth, they took that literally. So, well, that's where he's going to come from. And by the way, were they right?
Right.
Yeah, they were. So here we're simply just given the chief priests and scribes understood Micah to be speaking literally of where the Messiah would come from. And so they simply refer to that and quote that text explicitly. And of course, they were correct in their assessments because the Messiah was born in Bethlehem. And so in this case, it's pretty straightforward. Okay. The New Testament authors quoting from the Old Testament. Actually, in this case, it was the chief priests and scribes in Herod's day quoting directly from the Old Testament, and Matthew was writing it down. And they quote of this prophecy, and it is fulfilled literally, because that's where the Messiah was born. Let's go to a much more complicated one. I don't know if we'll have time to do this whole thing. Let's see. Yeah, I think we won't have time for this one. So I'll leave it in your notes. You guys can look at it. There's one other one I want to just briefly look at. Okay. And that's this one. Micah, again, we're in Matthew 2. Matthew 2, verses 13 to 15. We'll back up to, no, Jesse, are you able to read? Are you there, Jess? All right, he might be doing
Not
something.
working.
Mike's not working.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll go back up to you. Herman, can you read this passage in Matthew 2, 13 to 15?
Okay, Pastor Tim. Verse 13, Now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. So Joseph got up and took the child and his mother while it was still night and left for Egypt. He remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son.
Okay. And notice we again
Out of
have
Egypt.
a quote here, out of Egypt I called my son. And in this case, it is a direct quote of Hosea 11, verse 1. See that?
Israel.
Yeah, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. This is the prophet, what the prophet said. And notice Matthew also says this was to fulfill what had been spoken. Now, this passage is offered a lot of challenge. Okay, so how do we figure out what Matthew means here? Because if you go back and look at Hosea 11, it doesn't seem to be referring to the Messiah at all. All right. In fact, as Herman said, when Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And if you keep reading, I too taught Ephraim, right? That's another reference to Israel. All the way through here, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? He's speaking about Israel, not the Messiah. In fact, Hosea doesn't even bring up Israel's reconciliation or the days of the Messiah until Hosea chapter 14.
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
yeah, it might be that all the events happened in Israel also related to Jesus Christ.
Well, that's a big leap though. Certainly there are some parallels, like the 40 days in the wilderness and the Israel in the desert for 40 years. But that would be a stretch in this passage to make that connection.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a hard one. So what you have to do is you have to go back and understand what was the context in which Hosea gave that statement. Because again, the writers of the New Testament, we often make a big mistake. Whenever we see an Old Testament quote from a New Testament writer, we often assume the New Testament writer is just focusing on that quote. But often the New Testament writer understands the context in which that quote came, and often he is referring also to the context, not just the quote. Okay, there's a great example of this, just a side, in Ephesians chapter 4. Paul here quotes, it seems, from Psalm, was it 69, 68? And it says, Paul said, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, he gave gifts to men. Well, the thing is, if you go to Psalm 68:18, it doesn't say that. It said he received gifts from men. But see, Paul wasn't giving an exact quote. He understood the context of Psalm 68, that he did give gifts to men, and he also received gifts from men. And so Paul here is not really quoting just one part of the psalm. He's summarizing the whole psalm. And so here in Matthew, we have to consider, okay, when he makes this statement, out of Egypt I call my son, don't just focus on that short phrase. We have to understand what was Hosea saying back in Hosea. And you will find actually Hosea was actually referring to something said back in Exodus. So we have Matthew writing about something Hosea said, who was actually alluding to something that happened in the Exodus. So I'm not going to go through all the details here, but I want to just say this. And I gave you, actually, I'll post 2 articles about this verse. I'll post it on Canvas if you're interested in kind of seeing what the issues are. I'll give you 2 articles that you can take a look at just to see. The point I want to just make in looking at this passage is just to help us understand that these New Testament authors, they understood the whole context of which, whatever they were quoting, they knew the context of that passage. And often they connect what they were saying, not just to the specific words that they quote, but to the context in which they came. It'd be kind of like saying, if you were talking to your friend and you're describing some trials in your life and you say, I defeated that Goliath in my life. Okay. Well, when you say that, the name Goliath, we understand the whole story, right? You're bringing in a whole story by just referring to that name. Right? You're bringing in a whole story about David trusting in the Lord, defeating this giant who was fearsome and seemed to be undefeatable. And so by just referring to the name Goliath, you're importing a whole story into what you mean. All right? So in the same way, New Testament authors would often bring not just the quote that they're giving, but really the context in which that quote comes. That's why you have to go back to the Old Testament passage and understand it in its context. All right. And sometimes, like in this passage, what makes it so difficult is that Hosea actually is also alluding to an earlier passage in the Pentateuch. And you wouldn't know that until you study the context in Hosea. And you see what Hosea was saying, and then you can see, oh, this is what Matthew meant. All right. So it's too much, would take me too much time to walk through that. That's why I'll give you a couple of articles if you're interested on this passage, if you want to do some bonus study on your own for that. All right. And if I'm ever able to visit you guys, if the quarantine ever lifts, I'll try to bring you a book. It's called I can't remember the name of it. It's by Abner Chow. He wrote a book on how basically the hermeneutics of interpreting Old Testament quotations in the New Testament. How do you do that? It's a really helpful book. I'll try to bring some with me when I come visit you guys. And I think you'll find it very helpful.
I'm joining his hermeneutics class, Pastor Tim. There's like a free Pastor Devraj sent in.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's really helpful. It's Abner, right, Dr. Chow? Yeah. Yeah, if you can, he talks fast and there's a lot of information, but he really is really helpful, especially on the hermeneutics. He'll probably actually walk through this text with you and explain it. In fact, one of the articles is from him that I'm going to post. So I'm just bringing these up, guys, to help you, again, when you're confronted with the quotation of an Old Testament passage by someone else, you got to follow these 2 steps. Identify what the Old Testament author meant in his context. You have to start there. And then, how does that fit in the context of the New Testament passage? What was the author's flow of thought? So, for example, Matthew, why does he quote from that passage there in Matthew? Why does he quote from Hosea? But first, you go back and say, okay, what was Hosea saying in his context? What was he saying to his audience? And then you can connect it to what Matthew was saying to his. And I'll give you, there's a more detailed example I'll give you in the notes from Amos, who is quoted in Acts chapter 15. So you can read through that and see. Okay. And by the way, actually, the Old Testament prophets, they're not just quoted in the New Testament. Sometimes an Old Testament prophet is actually quoted by another prophet. There's one example in Jeremiah, where Jeremiah actually quotes Micah. Remember, Jeremiah prophesied during the exile. So this is like about 100 years after Micah. And he actually quotes from Micah. Chapter 3, by the way. He quotes from when Micah predicted that Jerusalem would become a ruins. Now, what Jeremiah was doing was, in this context, Jeremiah was being persecuted, and people were telling the king to kill him because Jeremiah was speaking against Israel, like saying, look, we're in trouble here. You need to submit to Babylon and go in exile. And that they wanted to kill him. But then Jeremiah says, hey, wait a minute. Even Micah, he predicted the ruin of Jerusalem, and they didn't kill him. He was a prophet of God. So why do you want to kill me? That was what he was doing there. But here's an example of, and there are a few others, where an Old Testament prophet quotes from an earlier Old Testament prophet. So you apply the same process with this too. You want to go back, what was Micah saying in his context, and then how is Jeremiah using it in his context? Okay, I know, a lot of information diving in. Hopefully some of that was helpful, made sense to you. I know it's not straightforward. Next week, we'll go through an example in Obadiah, and I'm hoping that as we go through that example, some of all this might make a little more sense. Like, okay, what are we doing here? I'm totally confused. I'm more confused than Michael was. So hopefully we're going to do a prophetic analysis on Obadiah next week. So if you could read through Obadiah again a few times just to be familiar with it, I think it'll help you get more out of our session next week. And we'll just walk through these 6 steps in Obadiah, using Obadiah as an example. Okay? And hopefully through that, it'll help you see exactly how these steps are intended to work and what they mean. All right? But thanks for hanging in there. I know sometimes these discussions on the prophetic genre are not easy. But, you know, I'm trying to give you just all the different issues that are involved here so that you, you know, are at least familiar with these things when you go to an Old Testament, especially an Old Testament prophecy. And hopefully some of this will, like, okay, I think I remember we talked about this during Taya. All right. But what does they say? There's a saying here in the US, no pain, no gain. All right. So we have to have a little pain here as we go through the prophets together. Any final questions or comments here? Again, all this will be in the notes. I hope that'll help explain anything that may not have been clear as we're talking about it. But any questions or comments you guys have? All right, that means you're hungry. You want to go to lunch.
Okay, Pastor King. We need to continue practicing to read. Actually, I apply that process in my Ephesians sermon at preaching lab, Pastor Kim, because I have in chapter 5 that
Ah,
one.
yeah. There's some quotes, Old Testament quotes in there, huh?
Yeah, Isaiah 61,
Mm-hmm.
Ephesians 5. This way. Well, 5:14. It's labor. So that's why I think if my interpretation is correct, if I get it to
Well, if you understand what Hosea or Isaiah was saying in his context, I mean, that's key. What was he saying to his hearers? Because the New Testament writer doesn't take people out of context. They understand that principle. All right, they're not going to say something, put something in the. They're not going to commit eisegesis, where that they're going to put their own thoughts in the mouth of the Old Testament writer. There's something from the context of that Old Testament passage that the New Testament writer is connecting to. So that's why it's a key. Go back and study the Old Testament passage and see if you can understand how does what the Old Testament authors say fit in the context there. That'll help you a lot with, okay, now I see why Paul is quoting from that passage. So, yeah, there's a lot of places in the New Testament that quote from the Old, even in the epistles.
How about Galatians 4, Pastor Tim, that they quote Paul about Sarah and Hagar?
Yeah, now there's an interesting text. There actually, Paul is, I think, implementing or using an allegory.
Allegory, yes.
Yeah. So there, and he explains it in chapter 4. He tells us what he's doing. So he's not interpreting some Old Testament passage. He's just saying he's using an illustration or an allegory of, Sarah and Hagar. One represented the law, the other represented promise, right? Or something like that, if I remember.
Yes.
Yeah. So he even says that. He's not expositing the Old Testament passage there. He's actually just using them as an illustration. Like we would, like I said with Goliath, I conquered that Goliath in my life. Well, I'm not expositing 1 Samuel 17. I'm just using that story to illustrate something happening in my life.
Okay.
That's different than expositing a text. And I think that's what Paul's doing in in Galatians 4. He's just using Sarah and Hagar as illustration of the point he's trying to make. And he says that directly, so we don't have to guess there.
Okay.
That's a good example that you brought up. All right. Well, I've tortured you enough today. I'll give you guys a break, and we'll convene next week again. Please spend a little time just getting refamiliar with Obadiah, because we're gonna go through that next week together and do prophetic analysis. Okay.
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 Edwin, can you close us in prayer? Are you available there?
Okay,